thank you very much for joining today. And you are in Bergamo right now, aren't you?
I am, yes.
And this is important because the reason why I'm mentioning this is because next year's conference from the International Transportation Economics Association will also be in Bergamo, and I expect you will be going, aren't you?
Most likely. But let me just put in a plug for next year. Bergamo is a wonderful place. There's an ancient city on top of a hill surrounded by a defensive wall. There are so many good restaurants. It's a beautiful place.
It's Italy.
I think it's a well-kept secret. At least it's a well-kept secret from American tourists who always go elsewhere in Italy. But boy, oh boy, it's a wonderful place.
Right. And so I'm really looking forward to be there. And I've been in Bergamo, and Italy is so nice. And the people, we also have so many colleagues at the University of Bergamo. And
well, as I've been telling them, it's a world center for aviation research. It really is. You have so many people here interested in the subject. And there's a flock of people in the engineering school who also do aviation.
I see.
So it's a really, really powerhouse group.
I see. Another thing that is related to the International Transportation Economics Association is the journal, Economics of Transportation. And my first question to you would be, how many papers have you published in Economics of Transportation?
I think about half a dozen. I've always viewed it as important to send papers there to, boost the journal and the association. So I have a lot of loyalty to the journal. And in fact, I have a paper under review at the moment with Ricardo Flores-Fiol.
Right. And actually, I think you have been one of those people in the very beginning pushing the idea of creating that journal. Am I
Yeah, that's
right?
true. That's true. I was. Along with a number of.
So what was the idea? Why did you do it? Why did you come up with the idea of, now we need economics of transportation? What was the point?
Well, the idea was to create a journal, a better journal for economics of transportation than existing journals. There are really hardly any journals with an economics focus on transportation. And so I thought we needed some more. And I think the journal has been fairly successful, although maybe we could be doing better. I don't know.
Okay. And the reason why we are coming together here today is because you have another paper, which I think is the first paper that has been accepted for the special issue on airline economics. And let's talk about this paper. So what's the topic?
Well, the paper is about how airlines try to cut fuel usage in their operations, some of the mechanisms that they use to do so. Now, the reason why this is important is because fuel usage is tied up with carbon emissions and therefore with climate change. So it's important to know how airlines attempt to reduce fuel usage in their fleets and therefore reduce carbon emissions.
And another point is, of course, that it really makes a big part of the airline operation cost. It's, how high is it?
Well, I think it's often as high as 40% of operating costs. So it's a very big number.
Really
so airlines are very sensitive to fuel costs.
And this is why cutting fuel is not only important for airlines, but also from the environmental perspective. This is what you mentioned with the carbon emissions, right? So it's a very important topic.
And there's a sort of a research boom now underway among economists and transport engineers about aviation and climate change and about carbon emissions. So it's a very hot research area. And this area is connected to that. It's not exactly about emissions. It's more about airline operations and fleet management in response to fuel prices. But all of those things have an emissions implication.
Right. And how do the responses look like?
Okay, so let me just do a little bit of background here to define a term that we use in the in much of the analysis, and that's the fuel cost per seat mile of an aircraft. Now, part of the fuel cost is based on the fuel price, right? How much does a gallon of fuel cost? The cost has been, around $1.50 and it goes up and down for 15 years or so. So that's basically what a gallon of jet fuel costs. Cheaper than gasoline. But another element that determines the cost per seat mile is the fuel efficiency of the plane. And our measure of fuel efficiency is gallons per seat mile. So that's how many gallons of fuel you need to fly one seat on the airplane 1 mile. So as an example, suppose you have a plane with 100 seats that flies 100 miles. That flight generates 10,000 seat miles, and it uses up a certain amount of fuel. So if you divide the fuel used by 10,000, you will have gallons per seat mile for that flight. Okay, so that's the idea. Gallons per seat mile is an inverse measure of fuel efficiency. In other words, more gallons per seat mile means the plane is less fuel efficient. So we combine this fuel price, gallons per seat mile, we multiply them together, and that gives us the fuel cost per seat mile. So the first part of the paper tries to see how airlines take into account cost per seat mile in several decisions that they make operationally. The first decision is speed. How fast do airplanes fly? And the second one is aircraft utilization, measured by what's called available seat miles. That's how many seats are flying that are available for occupancy by passengers. Okay. So what we have is data on aircraft operations by U.S. carriers. And so a unit of observation for us is going to be at the carrier aircraft type year level. We have 20 years of data. And so that's our unit of observation.
20 years. That's quite long.
Yeah. That's our unit of observation. And so the first regression that we run two of these operational regressions. The first one we run regresses speed. The speed of the aircraft, it's the average speed of the aircraft per year for a given type of plane. We get this using U.S. Department of Transportation data. So the average speed of an aircraft of a given type for a given airline in a given year. That's our observation. And then the right-hand variable in the regression is the cost per seat mile for that aircraft in that airline in the year. And again, the cost per seat mile
is it fuel cost or is it all the cost? Is it only fuel cost when you talk about cost?
So this is fuel cost.
Only fuel cost. Right? I see. Okay.
And then the regression has some other stuff in it too. But that's the main thing that we do. We run that regression on cost per seat mile, and then we do the same thing, another regression, similar structure, for available seat miles. What is that? It's the number of seat miles flown by an aircraft type on a particular airline in a given year. So we're going to regress available seat miles on cost per seat mile, fuel cost per seat mile. Again, airline carrier year. And so what we find is that the coefficients in these regressions are both negative. In other words, higher fuel cost per seat mile reduces speed and reduces available seat miles. So in plain English, what that means is that aircraft that have high cost per seat mile in a given year are flown slower than aircraft that have lower cost per seat mile. And the reason is that fast flying burns up a lot of fuel, especially for an inefficient plane. And so therefore, you expect there to be an inverse relationship. Now, the interesting thing about this, or the thing to bear in mind about this, is that there are two channels that work here. One is the fuel price channel. So it says that the fuel price is a contributor to cost per seat mile. So it's that channel says that if the fuel price is high for a given airplane type, fly slower.
Yeah.
It also, for a given fuel price, it says that
and the
looking
reason
across
I think,
your
I'm not
airplanes,
sure you have
looking
mentioned
across your
John.
airplanes, you should fly the more inefficient planes slower. So
right, but I think you didn't mention that by slowing down, that fuel efficiency can go up. That you can fly the same distances with less fuel if you kind of slow down the flight speed. I think you haven't mentioned that, but I think this is an important part. But of course, if you slow down much more, then
it probably went by too fast. But so let's talk about that for a second. So we know that if you're driving your car on an expressway and you go 80 miles an hour, you're going to use more fuel than if you go 50 miles an hour. I believe that for many cars, the fuel minimizing speed is around 50 miles an hour. But nobody goes 50 miles an hour on the freeway except for some old ladies who are scared of driving. Everybody goes faster, right? So it's the same thing with airplanes. Airplanes have the relationship between fuel use and speed is a U-shape. And at the bottom of the U, that's the 50 miles an hour for a car. But most planes fly in the uphill part of the U. And so slowing down would put them closer to the bottom of the U-shaped curve and thereby generate less fuel consumption. So that's the idea.
Because speeding up, basically, I guess the incentives for the airlines to fly faster is to basically have more flights, right? And then
there's that too.
Have a higher revenue.
So in other words, if the flights are shorter, you can fly more flights per day.
Right.
But I think it's also important that passengers like to get there sooner. And so
I see.
Passengers like a quick flight rather than a slow one. Just like you would rather get to your destination faster than when you're driving somebody who's going 50 miles an hour. Okay, so those are the two initial results in the paper, and they give.
Can I just ask one other question? Can you say something about when you talk about these two ways of cutting fuel or improving fuel efficiency? Which one do you think is more important empirically? Is it like, is the speeding, the control of the flight speed, the major factor helping to reduce fuel consumption, or is it rather the utilization? Do you have something?
Wait a minute. The gallons per seat mile is a fixed number. It's based on the technology of the plane. So the airline doesn't have any control over that if it's using a given type of plane. It can it can change the speed though, right? So there's only one channel, only one speed channel, but then there's the utilization as well. Is that what you were talking about?
Right. That's what I mean. Yeah. So these two channels, which of these two would be more important? Do you have any idea about that?
Not really. I'm not sure about that. But, the speed changes, if you change the speed by 8 miles an hour, for example, if you slow down 8 miles an hour, it'll produce a certain fuel savings and therefore emissions reduction. If you operate the plane, 8% less per year, same outcome, right? So anyway, and as far as the speed thing goes, I have a former student at National University of Singapore, and one of his good friends is a pilot for one of the low-cost Asian carriers. And I think he was discussing this research with his friend, and the friend said, "Oh yeah, when the fuel price is high, management tells me to slow down.
Interesting.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And that
they have
we
very small profit margins. They have small profit margins, so they really, typically, I would say, so they really need to manage their costs because otherwise they will not be profitable.
Right. So I thought that was a great anecdote, and it's in the paper there somewhere.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so another thing that we do beyond looking at these operational effects of fuel prices and fuel efficiency is we look at the effect of fuel prices on the changes in the composition of an airline's fleet.
Right. Okay.
So the things that we look at are the annual change in fuel efficiency for the average plane in the airline's fleet. So we compute average fuel efficiency weighted across all the plane types in the airline. And we also compute the annual change in the age of the airline's fleet. And these two things are associated because the newer planes are more fuel efficient. Okay. And then so what we run two more regressions. One with the fleet average fuel efficiency as a dependent variable. The other one with average age. And on the right-hand side, we have the change in the fuel price. And it turns out that the best fitting regression, the regression that works best, is the one that uses the contemporaneous change in the fuel price on the right-hand side. In other words, the annual change in the average fleet fuel efficiency depends on the contemporaneous annual change in the fuel price. And the relationship.
So with contemporaneous means, okay, so it means that in the fleet composition in 2023 depends on the fuel price in 2023. This
on
is
the change in the fuel, the change in the fleet composition. Sure, but anyway, same idea. And you may think, well, that's weird. Why would that be? It takes a while to adjust the fleet. Shouldn't there be responses to prior changes in fuel prices? Right. It turns out that our regression doesn't show that. But
interesting.
And you could argue, well, wait a minute. Fleets can't change immediately. But in some ways they can, because an airline can just suddenly say to its leasing company, I'm going to give you back 30 planes. I don't want these planes are not serving me well anymore. They're too fuel inefficient. So you can do stuff like that as an airline. You can change your fleet.
especially because leasing is a very common way of using aircraft for airlines.
Right.
Around 50% of the aircraft are actually leased. So
right.
We are not talking about just this is something substantial.
Right. But, also if an airline wants to sell a plane, there's a huge international market in used airplanes. And so you are
looking at domestic markets, right? You're looking at the U.S. domestic market, right? With your data. You
no, of course, but maybe when the airline is reducing its average fleet age, it's selling some of the planes to Latin America or someplace else, planes that it owns. So there's a very big international market in used planes. And so I think you can probably, if you want to sell a plane, you can probably do it in a hurry. But who knows? That we have this result that shows that these things are that average fleet fuel efficiency and average age are negatively related to the change in those things are negatively related to the contemporaneous change in the fuel price.
Right. Makes sense.
Okay. So that's another thing. So that's a fleet allocation, fleet composition effect of fuel prices. The last thing we do is sort of similar to this second exercise. We look at plane types that are being drawn down. In other words, eliminated from airline fleets. And we want to know how fast the drawdown is. How fast? What does it depend on? And so we ask how it depends on the fuel price and also on how bad the plane is relative to the average fuel efficiency of the fleet. So the old planes are going to have a higher gallons per seat mile than the average plane in the fleet. And so that should hasten their drawdown. And so we find that we look at those kinds of effects too. And we also do turn around and look at buildups for planes that are new and they're newly entering a fleet. And the buildup should be fast when there's huge incentive to modify the fleet. When the fuel price is
Basically,
high.
in terms of if the fuel prices are high, you would expect that they are kind of, trying to get more efficient aircraft
Right.
kind of more quickly, in a sense.
Of course, one of the problems right now in the aviation world is that both Boeing and Airbus have big backlogs of planes, right?
Right.
And so it's hard to get one. But, I'm no expert on this, but I bet you can always get your hands on a plane if you really want one, say in the leasing market.
Yes.
Anyway, so this paper was a lot of fun to write. It's sort of a paper that's almost designed for airline nerds, people who like to get down in the weeds of airline operations. But again, this is important because these operations have ultimate effects on global warming and climate change. So we should care about them, and we need to know about them and how they work.
So, what do you think? How important are they for the helping the aviation industry to get to the desired kind of net zero? Right. I mean, this is the goal by 2050. How strong will be the contribution of the fleet optimization, speed optimization?
Well, first of all, let me say that when you're focusing on road transportation, you can have a huge change in the fuel efficiency and carbon emissions from cars just by switching from a gas-powered car to an electric car. Huge difference in emissions. The trouble is that kind of easy switch is not possible in aviation, at least at the moment. And the reason is that electric airplanes are not really practical at the moment, even though there are some development.
And I think also the security, the safety standards, I think this is a very big issue. Just getting a new aircraft licensed.
No, you're right.
It's just something that really takes a very long time. This is just because the safety standards in aviation are beyond everything, I would say, observed in any other transport sector.
One of the people here at Bergamo, or actually several of the people, that Davide Scotti is with co-authors, is writing a paper on electric planes, and so he knows a lot about it. And the deal is that these planes are, at least initially, only going to be practical for very short flights, because you can't fly across the Atlantic Ocean without recharging a battery. Not possible. Okay, so these are going to be like hub feeder flights or whatever. That's where the planes are expected to be used. And maybe in 15 years, these planes will be out there and be flying around, and that will be good because it will reduce fuel usage and emissions. So what else besides electric planes? Well, there's something called sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, which is generated from biomass and natural non-petroleum sources, and it has low emissions, but at the moment it's very expensive. And so if all the airlines in the world were told that tomorrow they have to start using SAF, they would all have a gigantic drop in profits and would become
well, I mean, also the availability is
but then there's another issue, and that is availability. There's not enough of it to switch to SAF, even if somebody wanted to. And so the thought is that maybe in 20 years, the technology for production of sustainable aviation fuels will be more developed, the supply will be bigger, and they will be economical instead of unaffordable. Now, you can't be beguiled by some airlines' public relations efforts, which consist of flying a few flights here and there with sustainable fuel. It shows that they're thinking green, but it's not practical because they can't do it across all their flights at the moment.
Right. So, I mean, we have the environmental problem because It's not because it has to do with the incentives. I mean, it's just everyone, most people, or I'd say almost everyone, prefers to travel and at a low price, and that's it. So if you
Right.
wanna, if you then flying green is just more expensive. So if you can choose between flying green and not flying green, most people will simply choose not flying green, and that's why we need basically policies to implement
Right.
those goals, because people won't be doing it on their own.
I mean, there are some people out there, I'm not one of them, who are so environmentally conscious that they refuse to fly on planes, or they try to reduce their air travel. And that's admirable in a way, but it's not going to work as a solution to this problem, because altruism of this kind is not really viable as a means of getting big changes in the economy. As you say, we need changes in incentives, and for an
Right. And
economist,
it's a
we
global
get those.
problem. Yeah, it's a global problem. I mean, we see, for instance, in some places such as the Netherlands, Schiphol Airport, the idea is to reduce flights, and some of the reasons are environmental reasons. And then there are other places, such as in Eastern Europe, where there's a lot of growth, and people are very happy about growing the aviation market. And if we are looking even further east to Asia, of course, there will be a lot of growth. So I think protect the goal for aviation is to not stop aviation, but really to make aviation green in all ways possible. And there is an important other instrument, which is offsetting, right? I mean, this is when we're talking about, for instance, the European policies, EU emission trading schemes. Then we have what this does. It caps the total emissions in Europe, and it means that if aviation would not stop emitting, it wouldn't mean that the emissions would be increasing or would not be decreasing. It is such that if aviation would be having increasing emissions, then they would have to buy the certificates from other companies, who would
Right.
then have to increase their efforts in reducing emissions, so that overall the climate goals will be achieved.
Right.
So it's not
But
really
so we talked a minute ago
yeah,
about incentives, and the emissions trading system provides the right kind of incentives for all polluters, airlines
right,
and industrial plants and so on. And in effect, what it does is raise the price of fuel, because you're going to be you have to buy emissions permits corresponding to your fuel usage, and hence your emissions. And so the permits are costly, and so they add to the fuel price. So essentially what we're
right.
doing is raising the fuel price when we impose an emissions trading system on airlines. And
And
that's the right
may I
thing.
add, because there typically is a very common misperception, because people will then typically, if you bring forward this kind of argument that you have just made, people will say, "Oh, but in Europe, the airlines for a long time, or still have, get these free allowances." Which means that they get a large part, or in the past they've received a large part of the emissions, the certificates, basically for free. But
Right.
the point is that the incentives that you have just described are totally independent of whether you are getting the allowances for free or you have to pay for it, because of the opportunity cost. If you get them for free and you use them, you have some cost because you don't sell them in the market. So you
Right.
lose the revenue from selling the certificates in the market. So the incentives are basically independent of the initial allocation of the allowances. I think this is really something that
That's
there,
exactly right. That's exactly the way I teach cap and trade in my public economics course. In other words,
it's great.
it doesn't matter if you get them for free, because you can always sell them. And so anyway, so the ETS has had some effect on aviation operations in the EU. And your previous podcaster, Xavier Fageda, told you about this, showing that
Yes.
basically air travel within the EU went down a bit after airlines became subject to the ETS. And that's what we want, right? We want people not to
Right,
fly as much. We want them to
but you
take
see, I
account
think
of the
he got
environmental
some.
damage of flying.
Right, but he got some other results, which I thought was, I think, even for me personally, more interesting. Because what we like about market mechanisms is that those players who have high cost of abatement, they don't abate, and those with low cost of abatement abate. And what he found is, in some of his earlier studies, is that full service carriers basically haven't been really abating emissions, whereas low-cost carriers did. And you could make the point saying that for low-cost carriers, perhaps it was easier to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by switching routes or changing some of their operations, or perhaps not operating at all, than compared to full-service carriers. So you could make the point that they had different abatement costs, and that could explain why they responded differently to the EU ETS, but that's a strength of the ETS.
Right, exactly.
The point is, some people may say, oh, the full service carriers, they didn't respond. It didn't work for them. But I would say, no, it worked. It's exactly what we want.
So
we
this
want
is exactly
respond
like,
flexibly.
in my public economics course, and other people will say the same thing, that if you have a sort of a chip manufacturing plant and a steel factory, the steel factory is a big polluter. It has really high abatement costs. The chip plant is a low polluter, and so in response to carbon tax or whatever, it's going to really affect the steel plant a lot, not so much the chip factory.
And that's how it should be,
right?
Exactly. From the
exactly.
social perspective. That's
so, in other words, the people who can reduce pollution at the lowest cost should be the ones to do it.
Right.
So,
but I think this is really something that there is a lot of misunderstanding, I would say, by stakeholders, policymakers. And I feel this is why it's so important to highlight and emphasize those points.
Well, this notion that even if the permits are free, they still have the right incentive. That's very hard for a non-economist to get their head around, right?
Yeah, it's true.
It requires a lot of explanation.
So this is why we have this discussion. One reason for having this kind of discussion.
Right. What else was I going to say? I guess I'm sort of wrapped up with these topics. Is there something else we need to talk about?
Well, I was wondering, because you are looking at the US data, now we were talking about Europe, but I would say your results will, most likely carry over to other, areas, right?
Well, I think so.
In the world. I mean, these are just economic principles, and they will hold no matter if they hold in the US, but also other places in Asia, China, Europe. Right?
I agree. Anyway, this is an interesting set of topics, and as I said, research is expanding a lot in this area. The trouble is that we can't make a huge impact on aviation emissions in the short term. It's just not easy to do.
This is why I think understanding the economics and how economic mechanisms work is so important. So this is put into right perspective, I would say.
Right.
Because it's hard to abate. They also shouldn't be abating too much. Others should be abating.
Exactly.
And then they should be, somehow the incentives should be right so that they sort of internalize those effects.
So you might get a kick out of reading the chapter of my urban economics textbook on pollution, which has just uses diagrams, and it tells a lot this story with many of the same points being made. I'll send it to you if you like.
So I will put the link or the information in the description below. So all the viewers who are interested, I would recommend you should be reading the book. And I think John, something that you would just say in the very beginning is that I think a lot of people are working on this area, but I also feel there are still so many open questions. And I think one of your strengths, so to say, of your research is that you always inspire a lot of people to kind of follow your lines of research. And I hope that, and I expect actually that this is also going to happen with this strand of research.
Well, I hope so. But, you know, you got to realize that there are lots of people inspiring themselves to do research. Just, you know, it's a big community. The transportation engineers are doing this. Economists are doing it. It's a very big community. I'm all in favor of things that are simple and transparent. However, I'm not a big believer in crippling complexity of research. Some people like complexity for its own sake, but I think it's better to be simple if you can.
Well, I would agree. I totally agree with this. Although I know that we're having a lot of discussions because we have been collaborating on a couple of projects together. It was always great, but we also had always a lot of kind of heated discussions.
Oh,
but
yeah,
this is the fun part.
It was interesting and fun, and anyway, it's always productive, I think.
Thank you, Jan.